We're talking about the gospel and the city in particular. We're talking about the gospel coming into Philippi in Acts chapter 16. And really we're preparing ourselves to go into the book of Philippians, and where we're going to see some of these key themes that we're talking about last week and this week. We're going to see them played upon each and every chapter of Philippians really along the way. But what I want to remind you of, when we're talking about Acts 16 and the place of Philippi, I want to remind you that Philippi was a place that was a leading city and a Roman colony. That's what Acts 16:12 says. And what we said that meant really is we talked about the city of Philippi as a place that had a proud history of where they came from, how they began, a proud history both of being the city of Philippi, a Roman colony with all of the rights and freedoms, as I mentioned there, all the rights and freedoms, but also not just the historic city of Philippi, but their connection to Rome gave them all of the Roman history to be proud about as well. A place of wealth on a trade route, an important place in Greece. A city of rights and freedoms that we'll mention in just a moment. And then a city of religious diversity, pluralism, where they tolerated several different religions. If you wanted to worship this way, you could, or that way you could, with a few exceptions. We'll even see in Acts chapter 16 as well. Anyway, the point is, the city of Philippi may not be that different from our own experience, and we'll see that momentarily. Let me tell you about the Philippian rights. Let me tell you about their freedoms that they had. As Roman citizens, they had freedoms like the freedom to vote. That's something that we prioritize, that we hold near and dear here in the States. They had the right, the freedom to hold office if they were elected. They could serve in the military, and by that I mean they could have jobs in the military rather than just, being like slaves that were made to go fight. They could own property. They had the freedom to own property, to sell it, to, leave it to their heirs or whatever the case might be. They could make business agreements, contracts. They had the right to a fair trial as Roman citizens, and they could even appeal to Caesar himself if they believed that they were treating unjustly, and they would be given a hearing or taken to Rome so that they could have a hearing before Caesar or some, representative of Caesar. So you remember that in Acts 25, Paul himself does this. He says, I appeal to Caesar. And that's how Paul winds up in Rome. But the point is, there are these and other rights that the Philippians had because of their Roman citizenship. Now, last week, what we talked about was how God calls us to the city as a place where people are that need to know Him and need to experience the gospel. And when the gospel and people that are on fire about the gospel, when the gospel comes into a place like Philippi, people are converted. Lydia in Acts 16 is converted. There's the slave girl. There's the Philippian jailer. 3 different and unique accounts. We're not going to rehash last week's lesson, but just remember that these people experience the gospel in very different ways. Lydia, her mind is open to the Scriptures. She's converted by the truth of the gospel. The slave girl, she's demon-possessed, and it's the power of the gospel that opens her mind, opens her heart. And then there's the Philippian jailer, when he sees the people are still in jail after they could have escaped, his heart just wonders. He's in awe and says, what do I need to do to be saved? So there's truth, there's power, and there's wonder, worship, awe, however you want to say that. All of these things are playing a role. So we talked about how the gospel converts the city. Now we're talking about, this morning, how the gospel confronts the city. Because when the gospel came to Philippi, not quickly, but pretty quickly, Paul goes from being a interesting guy, maybe even a tolerated guy, maybe even somebody says, I think this is a nice guy, to being thrown in jail and locked up in the dungeon, basically, because of what he says. The gospel's converting people, but the gospel's also confronting some of the core beliefs of the place. In this case, Philippi, but in our case, Columbus, Georgia. So, when we think about the gospel confronting the city, one of the things that Paul is going to confront in Acts 16 for the Philippians is the gospel is going to confront the nature of freedom. The nature of freedom. What I want you to see today, and that's why there's a parallel to today, what I want you to see today, and I'm going to borrow the words of William Willimon, but he says there's freedom and then there's freedom. And we'll see what that means as we go. There's freedom, and then there's freedom. We think of ourselves as Americans as being citizens of the land of the free. We sing it sometimes, right? The land of the free. I just put up a sampling of rights that we have as Americans. We had the right, for instance, to assemble here today. We have freedom of speech. We have freedom to bear arms. We have freedom to fair trial. The Bill of Rights even says it should be a speedy and public trial, right? You can't have a fair trial, but we'll get to it in 30 years. You have the right to a fair trial. You have the right to own property and land. You have the right to not face cruel and unusual punishment. And you could go and look at the Constitution and find other rights that you got as well. The point is, there's a lot of these privilege, these rights that we have, these freedoms that we have as Americans that we hold near and dear, and rightly so. I'm thankful that we can say what we want and we can assemble together, and we have fair trials that we can be granted, and so forth and so on. The point is, we live in a very free place. But the question that I want to ask you today, because they lived in a very free place, comparatively speaking, back then too. What I want to ask you today, and what Paul and his message confronts the Philippians with, is this question: are we free? Are we free? We have the Bill of Rights, and we have all of these freedoms, but I want to ask you the question: are you really free? Am I really free? Are you free when, to borrow the words of one person, when you go back to your house and the medicine cabinet's full and the burglar alarm is armed, Are you free when you have fears in the back or maybe even the forefront of your mind about strokes and heart attacks and what's going to happen if this, catastrophe happens, and you listen to the news and everything's going wrong? Are you free, really and truly? Are you free when you have never lived in a world that has more choice than you have right now, today? You could have the entertainment you want, the music you want, with limitations. You could have the car you want. Even if you can't afford it, you could go and get a lot of car for very little money, right? I hear it on the radio all the time. If you have $0, you can qualify. You can have the career of your choice, by and large. You can live in the city that you want to live in. You can, and on and on and on we can go. You can wear the clothes you want to wear. You can listen to the YouTube videos you want to listen to. But are you free? Are you free when, in light of all of those choices, you find road after road after road to loneliness, to heartbreak, disillusionment, cynicism? Are you free when, in light of all of the opportunities out there and everything, and yet you're crushed under the weight of questions like, who am I though? I don't think I know who I am. I don't know my identity. And all of these people in society are trying to get me to figure out my identity as being my allegiance to this group or that group or this part of me or this aspect of my background or whatever. But the question is, are you really free? Are you really free? You have more money than anybody probably in history has had. Not you individually, but collectively here in this room and in our country. And yet, we're the most worried about money that probably any people's ever been. Are you free? Are you really free? When the gospel comes to Philippi, in Acts chapter 16, we find that Paul is preaching in Acts 16, verse 16. He's going about and he's teaching people about Jesus. And there's a woman, and we talked about this a little last week, so we won't have to necessarily go into every detail. But there's a woman here, a young girl perhaps, who has been possessed by a demon. She's got a spirit of divination. And she follows in verse 17, Paul saying, "These men are servants of the Most High God who proclaim to you the way of salvation." She kept doing this for many days, and Paul And greatly annoyed, turned and said to the spirit, I command you in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her. And it came out of her that very hour. We mentioned last week that probably what's happening here is Paul knows as soon as I cast this demon out, I'm going to tolerate it as long as I can so I can preach and preach and preach, because when I cast this demon out, I'm going to be thrown into jail, and that'll be my last opportunity in Philippi for a while. And indeed, that is what takes place. I want you to think about these owners of this slave girl. When Paul begins preaching, this girl's following after Paul and presumably making money for these owners. In fact, they're going to accuse Paul, they're going to get very irritated with Paul, I should say, in verse 19, because they saw that their hope of gain was gone. Listen, when the gospel first starts coming into Philippi, the owners of this girl are saying, you know, this Paul, he's not a bad guy. We can use this for our purpose. We can actually turn a profit out of this preaching. We'll have our girl follow, and she'll say things, and she'll start, telling people their futures and so forth and so on. So they see the gospel as a means to their ends. And I will just go ahead and say we would be very naive if we think that that is not happening today. That there are people that are more than happy to let a little Paul in, right? More than happy to let a little about Jesus in, but ultimately it goes to serve whatever their purpose is and whatever their plans are, rather than true, genuine submission to what Jesus has called us to. They see that their hope of gain was gone. That's where there's going to be this confrontation. In John chapter 8, verse 36, it says, if the Son makes you free, you will be free indeed. That's what Paul is going to show this community. He's going to show them that there's a different kind of freedom. There's a different kind of liberation that takes place when you know Jesus, as opposed to when you're pursuing your own ends, your own means, and you're living on this constant edge of despair and disappointment and disillusionment and heartbreak and so forth and so on. Acts 16 is going to show us the slavery of the free and the path to real freedom. The slavery of the free and the path to real freedom. Acts chapter 16. It starts with Paul's manifestation of the gospel power by driving out this demon from this woman. Now, I would think that there's probably some diversity of opinion in our room, but probably most people are operating in their daily lives as if demon possession in the New Testament is not happening today. Let me just give you a word of warning that what you mean by that is not that the powers and forces of evil are no longer at work. I pray that each and every one of us believes that the forces of evil, that Satan, the adversary, is still, like Peter said, roaming around like a lion looking for the one that he might devour. One of the greatest marketing tricks that the devil has played on the world is getting him to be this little guy with the horns on the people's shoulder, and he looks like a fairy tale. He looks like a fantasy. And yet Peter says he's like a lion there in the brush waiting to kill, waiting to devour. And Paul, in this case, does what he can do through Jesus Christ to bring an end to what evil is doing in this woman's life. And I'd like to urge us to realize that the mission of the church involves manifesting that same power. Not going around driving out demons and stuff. Working against the forces of evil that are at work in this world. That's part of what the church has been called to do. That when the gospel comes in, it doesn't just say, well, there's a nice future for you out there. But people that believe the gospel labor and struggle to push back against evil. Not through violence, not through, waging war. No, through following the model of Jesus. Through going 2 miles instead of 1. Following Jesus and laying down their life, even if that's necessary. But the people of God cannot see evil happening and just say, well, we'll just get on with that later. Let's just focus on the message. No, Paul doesn't do that at all. Paul casts out the demons. We drive out the forces of evil. That leads to confrontation because they don't like this one bit. Their hope of gain is gone, and so they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace before the rulers. And in verse 20, they brought him to the magistrates, and they said, "These men are Jews. They're disturbing our city. They advocate customs that are not lawful for us as Romans to accept or practice." They say, "We've got here with these people." Here's what they say. They're disturbing the peace. They're anti-Roman. They're Jewish. They're anti-Roman. They're dishonoring our traditions and customs. We better beat them up. We better lock them up. And that's exactly what happens to Paul and Silas. They're beaten up and they're thrown into jail. What I'd like for us to be challenged by this morning is the realization that a church that does nothing in the community has nothing to lose, has no risk involved. If Paul did nothing in Philippi except every now and then say, "I'm a Christian and it's a nice thing," if Paul did nothing in the community, he would have had nothing to lose. And yet he would have had everything to lose. Because who he was as a disciple was an ambassador of Jesus Christ, a representative of Jesus in the world. And Paul says, how can I, just like Peter and John when they're taken before people, they say, how can we stop speaking? How can we stop laboring? How can we stop working in this place? You can beat us up if you want. We've got to pursue God's will for the world. They had nothing to lose. A church that does nothing has nothing to lose and everything to lose. But here's the flip side of that coin. A church that acts with gospel power in the world will face confrontation and hostility. They'll be met with confrontation and hostility. Because whether it's financially, whether it's in terms of power, influence, social standing, whatever the case might be, somebody is going to see that their hope of gain is gone if Jesus' message really is true. And if the church is working in the world to liberate people from the bonds of sin, a world of addiction, abuse, prejudice, homelessness, you name it. You go down the line. Materialism, extreme materialism. A world of anger and hate, a world of just bitterness, a world of cynicism. If the gospel comes in and starts driving that out, somebody's not going to be happy with that because their hope of gain is going to be gone. Their hope of gain is going to be gone. So, a church that does nothing has nothing to lose. A church that acts with gospel power, they're going to be met with confrontation and hostility, and yet it is through that hostility that Paul demonstrates to us today that there's freedom indeed in Jesus Christ. And it happens in Acts chapter 16, verse 25. Paul and Silas are thrown in jail, and it's midnight, and they're in a dungeon, and they're chained up. You know, their legs are in the stocks, probably 5 feet from them or less. There's some guy that murdered somebody. It smells, it stinks. It's a little hole in the ground that they've been put in, probably. And Paul and Silas are in there crying out to God in despair, saying, "Lord, why me?" No. They're in the jail, and it says at midnight, Paul and Silas were singing and praising and praying to God. They were singing. We sing different songs, and I like to think of them singing different songs. Obviously, they did not know our songs. But when Paul and Silas are in prison, one of the songs that I think of is the lines of the song. I'll save my singing for 5 p.m. How can I keep from praising your name? How can I ever say enough? How amazing is your love? Paul and Silas are in their jail cell, not even a cell, in their jail hole in the ground, and they're singing praises to God. They're, by every definition of the world, they are no longer free. And yet they're the most free people in Philippi. And you say, how can that be? That's what the jailer wants to know. How can that be? Because an earthquake comes, and they could have ran out, and they could have recaptured their freedom as people that were no longer in jail. Literally, the jail is broken open, right? So when the jail is broken open, they could just start sprinting out, and they could leave, and they could have freedom. But it wouldn't be freedom indeed. And so as Paul and Silas stand there in prison, sit there in prison singing, this earthquake happens. The prisoners, they convinced the prisoners to stay around, and the jailer called for the lights when Paul said, "Don't hurt yourself," in verse 28. In verse 29, the jailer called for lights and rushed in, and trembling with fear, he fell down. Fear is another word in the Bible for awe, by the way. Wonder, fear, awe. He's amazed. He fell down before Paul and Silas, and he brought them out and said, and here's the thing, he didn't say, "How come you stayed?" He didn't say, I really would like to know what it is, on the basis of what do you have this faith. He says, how can I get what you've got? What do I need to do to be saved? The Philippian jailer had all of the freedoms of his Roman citizenship. People in our community, we've got all the freedoms of our American citizenship. But the Philippian jailer fell at Paul's feet and said, how do I get free? How do I get really free? And Jesus says, when the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. You see, in our story today, the person in chains is the person that is most free, and the person that's not in chains is the person most slave. Because the freedom that Jesus offers is a freedom that is so enduring and so beyond, transcendent beyond circumstance, that Paul could be in chains and he could be singing, and the jailer could be out of chains and he could have his sword ready to take his own life because of the despair that was setting in, because things weren't going well at work, to say the least. Paul says there's freedom, and there's freedom indeed. And if we are going to work in our community, we're going to have to be people whose ultimate priority for every person that we meet is that they could be set free indeed. That they could experience what it is to have the freedom that Jesus Christ brings to their life, no matter what the circumstance. The great thing, and this is the last thing that we'll say, the great thing about the gospel and the power of the gospel is the more confrontation, the more the world tries to stop the gospel power from getting out, the more gospel power there is. It's through Paul being persecuted for the gospel power that set the slave girl free that the jailer's heart is overcome with the power of the gospel, with the wonder of the gospel. It's through their attempts to get them, just to keep them quiet, and then it'll all be okay. And the gospel just gets more and more and more powerful. Because when people see that there's freedom, and then there's a whole other kind of freedom, they say, that's nice. I need that. I really need that. Because only that is not tied to anything else. If my satisfaction in life is tied to my job, it's tied to my family, if my joy is tied to where I live, where I happen to be born, if my ability to have joy in life is tied to my rights, my freedoms, my privileges, whatever the case might be, if my joy is tied to anything, then it can be taken from me like that. But only Jesus offers a joy where you could take everything and you're still free. If you need to be set free this morning, we want to offer you an invitation. We want to offer you an invitation that perhaps you say, I believe in Jesus. I want that freedom. I want to be cleansed of my sins so that I can have a clean conscience, so that I can live as free indeed, putting all my trust in Jesus. I want to be washed in baptism. Whatever the case might be, we want to invite you to come as we stand and sing.